Welcome to the Not Old Better Show, Smithsonian Associates Interview Series on radio and podcast. The show covering all things health, wellness, culture, and more. The show for all of us who aren't old, we're better. Each week, we'll interview superstars, experts, and ordinary people doing extraordinary things, all related to this wonderful experience of getting better, not just older. Now, here's your host, the award-winning Paul Vogelzang.
Welcome to the Not Old Better Show Smithsonian Associates Interview Series 60th anniversary on radio and podcast. In 1839, 5 women gathered in a Boston parlor asking 2 profound questions. What are we born to do? How shall we do it? Their answers helped shape one of the most important intellectual movements in American history, Transcendentalism. We know the names Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau, but what about Mary Moody Emerson, Elizabeth Palmer Peabody, Sophia Peabody Hawthorne, Lydia Jackson Emerson, and Margaret Fuller? What about them? These women weren't just observers of the movement, they were its architects. They nurtured its philosophy, challenged its leaders, and laid the foundations for American feminism. Yet, history largely ignored them. Their ideas, often groundbreaking, were overshadowed by the men they inspired. Until now. Today, we welcome Smithsonian Associate Dr. Randall Fuller, the Herman Melville Distinguished Professor of 19th Century American Literature at the University of Kansas, to uncover the hidden story of Transcendentalism. Smithsonian Associate Dr. Randall Fuller will be appearing at Smithsonian Associates coming up. Please check out our show notes today for more details on his presentation titled Bright Circle, 5 Remarkable Transcendentalist Women. His book of the same name is available at Apple Books. It's titled Bright Circle, 5 Remarkable Women in the Age of Transcendentalism. Challenges us to think about and even know more about this movement and restores these women to their rightful place in history. Did Emerson's most famous ideas actually begin with his aunt? Did a woman's journal from Cuba shape the way Americans saw nature? And how did one wife push her husband to take a stand on abolition? This is a conversation about influence, erasure, and the intellectual power of women in a time that tried to silence them. So let's step back into the 19th century and meet the women who changed America without ever getting credit. Dr. Randall Fuller, welcome to the program.
I'm delighted to be here.
It's nice to talk to you. So nice to meet you. I think this subject is one that broadly, I think we need to know a little bit more about. Certainly our audience, I know, is going to be interested in the subject of your new book, your upcoming presentation at Smithsonian Associates. Why don't we just start there, perhaps, and just tell us a little bit about what you're going to tell us at your Smithsonian Associates presentation. And in particular, we're all on Zoom these days. Maybe tell us how you'll use Zoom to engage us all.
Yeah, that's great. I am really looking forward to the Smithsonian talk. The 5 women who I will be discussing were each great conversationalists, great share of ideas, great intellects who love nothing better than to get together and to talk philosophy, art, literature, those kinds of things. And I am quite sure that if they had been alive today, instead of traveling to Boston from New York and Concord and various other places, they would have been all too happy to have clicked on a Zoom link and to have engaged.
Perfect.
Yeah, and
Perfect.
To have engaged in one of their conversations. And so that's why I'm looking so much forward to the presentation. To be honest, the women of what I call the Bright Circle are so engaging, or so captivating as women, as thinkers, as writers, that I think that Zoom viewers won't have a lot of difficulty connecting with them. But it will be my task to try to bring them to life through stories and examples. And I will also have some photographs and illustrations to help bring women from 170 years ago to life.
It's going to be a great presentation. Looking forward to it. We will have links in our show notes today so that our audience can find out more about your upcoming presentation at Smithsonian Associates, as well as more information about you. Smithsonian Associate Dr. Randall Fuller is joining us. The book talks about this bright circle, these 5 women, and we'll know some names. Certainly, we'll know the name of Emerson, we'll know the name of Thoreau, but we may not know some of the other names, particularly the women that you highlight and their role in all of this. Why why would we not know those names? What's kind of been overlooked here that really is an important aspect to the development of Transcendentalism?
Yeah, several things, I think. One is that Transcendentalism is closely tied up with the myth of the romantic individual, and especially the myth of the romantic male individual. So I love teaching Henry David Thoreau's Waldo. I have actually had students so inspired by Walden that they've temporarily dropped out of school so that they
Yeah.
could go live in nature.
It's
But
wonderful.
that is only one side of the Transcendentalist movement, and that is again is kind of the myth, and I think it really is a myth of the romantic individual. The women tended to create different artifacts than the men. That is, Emerson and Thoreau always were interested in publishing their ideas and their experiences, but the women tended to do that more through journals, which they shared with one another, through letters, and most importantly through that most evanescent medium, the conversation. They tended to get together and discuss ideas. And because women in general were discouraged from entering the public realm of publication, we simply don't know as much about them. That they tended not to write for a public, except in a couple of cases, and they tended not to encourage that ideal of the romantic individual alone scribbling in a solitary garret someplace, but they were much more conversational and communal in their activities.
Well, congratulations on the book and all of the research. I'm curious, we are most familiar with the men of Transcendentalism. What first led you to this, involvement with the women, and what kind of grabbed your attention there? Where did you really find that spark in all of this to focus on this aspect of this subject?
Yeah, I had long been noticing. I should back up a moment and say I like to tell people I've lived in the 1830s and 40s for most of my adult life, as at least professionally. I've spent a lot of time
Yeah.
imagining the lives of Emerson and Thoreau and others. As somebody who does that, I had long been interested in these very fleeting glimpses of the women that I would encounter in biographies. They would appear, but they would often appear in a somewhat dismissive role. Mary Moody Emerson, who was Ralph Waldo Emerson's aunt, was often kind of dismissed with one word, which was eccentric. His wife, Lydia Jackson Emerson, was similarly often dismissed with the notion that she was kind of a depressive housekeeper.
Mm.
And I thought that probably wasn't the case. My sense just from reading the letters of the Emerson family was that this was a very intellectual, intelligent, gossipy family. All of them were not just the men, but the spark. And this is a shout out to the archive here at the University of Kansas, where I've been for 8 years. The spark occurred when I was interviewing for the position here, and our archivist said, "I've got something that I think you might be interested in."
Hmm.
And what it was a first edition of Emerson's landmark first book called Nature, inscribed to Aunt Mary Moody Emerson.
Wow.
Uh, Experts on Mary Moody Emerson did not know that this existed. I wrote them and asked them, "Do you know that this is out there?" But what was wonderful about it is there was marginalia, and there were places in the book where Mary Moody Emerson approves with pride in her nephew's writing, and there are also places in the book where she disagrees with him, and does not hesitate to kind of quarrel with him in the margins of his book. And what that did for me was made me realize that there was a possible archive of these women in existence that I would be able to tap into and try to understand, and would enable me to understand them as best as I could.
I'm curious about the influence of Mary Moody Emerson on Ralph Waldo Emerson. Did you see any evidence that this kind of, perhaps she was incorrectly known as eccentric, but maybe radical? Did you see some of those ideas kind of make their way into Ralph Waldo Emerson's writings, noting that kind of influence?
Very much so. So I consider Ralph Waldo Emerson's voice one of the most distinctive in all American literature. But when you begin to read the letters that he exchanged with his Aunt Mary, who became a kind of de facto parent after his father died when he was age 11, when you begin to read the letters and you begin to read some of the things that Ralph Waldo writes in his journals, you realize that distinctive voice is in many ways modeled on his Aunt Mary Moody Emerson's. He said Mary Moody Emerson is the best writer in the United States, and he self-consciously sought to embody her voice to a certain extent. But the influence wasn't only in writing style; it was also in thinking style. Mary Moody Emerson was one of the really early passionate enjoyers and celebrators of nature. She kind of comes from this Puritan background, and Puritans in general considered nature the domain of Satan, and the wilderness was the place where you did not want to go. You wanted to remain in civilization with your fellow Puritans. That's faded somewhat by the time Mary Moody Emerson comes of age, but it still is still part of the cultural imagination. And Mary Moody Emerson is quite original in her love of nature and in her ascribing the divine in nature. And when Ralph Waldo Emerson was a young boy, he thought nature was boring, of no interest whatsoever. And she scolds him in this wonderful letter that's 6 pages long, about why he needs to take nature more seriously. So she had profound influence on him as a writer and a thinker. And only later in his life does he sort of acknowledge just how much she meant to him.
That's wonderful. Thank you very much for sharing that. Let's talk about one of the other women that you write about, Elizabeth Palmer Peabody, and her role in all of this intellectual discourse that's kind of going on, and transcendentalism that's kind of coming to the fore, certainly through her I believe in the book she owns a bookstore herself.
Yes.
Where some of this kind of discussion takes place. What role did she play? And tell a little bit about her and kind of the influence that she had here.
Yeah, she was this great cultural entrepreneur, a great intellectual entrepreneur. She had been raised by a mother who, as an early feminist, insisted that women were as intelligent as men and should be educated to the same level as men. And her mother engaged in that very activity. She taught Elizabeth Palmer Peabody languages, history from ancient Greece, literature from France. I mean, Elizabeth Palmer Peabody had the equivalent of a Harvard education by the time she was 14 or 15 years old. But she also had the difficulty of being an intellectual woman at a time when that was frowned upon largely. And so her life is, in many ways, the story of a wonderfully congenial, friendly, intellectual woman who tries to make her way in a world that sometimes feels hostile. She was a teacher. She was a publisher. She wrote essays and articles. But for my purposes, at least, the most important thing she did, and in many ways the most important thing she did for the Transcendentalist movement, was open a bookstore in 1839 that was on West 13th Street in Boston, and which quickly became known as the kind of intellectual hotspot. Every time I think about this bookstore, I'm a little melancholy because I live in the world of Amazon, and there's not quite the same intellectual hub that this bookstore was, but it was stocked with books from Europe that were unavailable anyplace else in the United States, and as a result, it became this real focal point for all kinds of reform and intellectual extreme thought experiments and various things like that. So, for example, some of Boston's early abolitionist meetings take place there. Some of the so-called Transcendentalist clubs were held there. The Brook Farm utopian community was first discussed there. But most important, the bookstore had been open for a couple of months, and Margaret Fuller asked Elizabeth Peabody if she could use the bookstore to host her conversations, which were these weekly 2-hour-long discussions by 20 to 25 women about all sorts of topics.
Hi, this is Paul. Before we jump back into today's show, I want to take a moment to recognize a truly special milestone, Smithsonian Associates' 60th anniversary. Since 1965, Smithsonian Associates, the largest museum-based education program in the world, has been inspiring lifelong learners with unforgettable experiences, connecting audiences with the Smithsonian's museums, research, and experts in new and exciting ways. This year, the celebration is for you, with a full year of special programming both online and in person, from behind-the-scenes looks at Smithsonian collections to conversations with astronauts, historians, filmmakers, and curators. There's something for everyone. Whether you want to explore the legacy of the space shuttle, uncover untold civil rights stories, or even get hands-on with art and gardening workshops, Smithsonian Associates has created something extraordinary. I'm proud to partner with Smithsonian Associates to share their incredible programs with the Not Old Better Show audience. Thanks for being part of this journey. Here's to 60 years of curiosity, learning, and discovery. Our guest today is Smithsonian Associate Dr. Randall Fuller, who has written the excellent new book, Bright Circle, 5 Remarkable Women in the Age of Transcendentalism. Let's talk about one of the other women that also named Peabody, Sophia Peabody, and her role in all of this, and especially when it comes to kind of an inspiration about Transcendentalism and the writing around it. She really describes in very vivid detail nature itself. And I'd like to hear you talk a little bit about some of her descriptions, because they're beautiful, and how they influenced some of the men around her about this subject too, because it's we're starting to see that there's a real connection here between these women and ultimately what came.
Yes. And one tiny minor correction, which is the 19th century pronunciation of her name was Sophia. And
Sophia.
that's
Good.
a
Thank you.
pronunciation we no longer have, but that's the way her name was pronounced.
Perfect. Thank you.
Sophia Peabody is the younger sister of Elizabeth Palmer Peabody. And like a lot of siblings, she largely defined herself against her older sibling, Elizabeth. That is, Elizabeth is this brainy intellectual who early on makes a decision not to get married because to do so would be to interfere with the life of the mind and the life of a writer that she aspires to. Sophia, on the other hand, longs for romantic love, but she also is far more artistic in her way of looking at the world. She is one of the earliest women in the United States to make a living as a painter. She studies with some of the top American painters of the period, and some of her art is in the Peabody Essex Museum to this day, and you can look and see what an accomplished painter and artist she was. But she suffered from poor health, and in the mid 1830s, in an effort to alleviate that poor health, she goes to Cuba for a year and a half. She stays on a coffee plantation while a middle sister, Mary Peabody, teaches. And the goal is that she will recuperate and her health will be restored while she's there. What happens to her? What happens to this artistic sensibility in this beautiful, lush, tropical landscape that is so different from New England is that her senses are kind of awakened to the natural world around her. And she writes this extensive journal, which really takes the form of letters to her mother and comprises some 900 pages over the time that she's in Cuba. Much of it filled with lush, painterly descriptions of sunsets and tropical flowers and the color of mountains and the aroma of orange groves and things like that. Well, that writing, I mentioned earlier that Elizabeth Peabody was a kind of cultural entrepreneur. At the time, she was also considered kind of a busybody. And she was so taken by her sister's writing that she copied that writing and distributed it to friends all throughout New England, including the Emerson family. So Emerson seems to have been aware of this kind of nature writing that was really unparalleled in American letters at that time. She's writing almost 20 years before Henry David Thoreau's Walden, for example. And while it's it's much more difficult in her case to find a direct linkage the way you can with Mary Moody Emerson and Ralph Waldo Emerson. It seems pretty clear that he admired her aesthetic sense, and he references her in one of his essays entitled Art.
So lots of relations, lots of relatives here in this book of yours. Ralph Waldo Emerson's own wife, we talked about his aunt, his own wife, Lydia Jackson Emerson, had her own role to play in some of this. And she really encouraged kind of an activism and an awareness and kind of, let's take this to the streets, so to speak. Let's really make this well known. Tell a little bit about her. I found her fascinating, and especially because we often think of women in those times to not really be heard from much and to be very much behind the scenes. But here was someone who really felt strongly and encouraged her husband to do something about it. I thought that was very impressive.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I should say, you mentioned the family connections, and there's a reason for those family connections, and it goes back to what can be found in various repositories and archives around the country. And the simple fact is that relations of Emerson or Nathaniel Hawthorne and Sophia Peabody married Nathaniel Hawthorne eventually. their material is considered worth preserving because they were close to these writers. There were all sorts of women who were involved in this movement, many of whom there is not any existing material in any archive that I was able to find. So at any rate, that's one reason why there's so much sort of familial connection here. Lydia Jackson Emerson was always described as an extremely sensitive and principled person who was upset at any sort of injustice. Today, we would call her a social justice warrior. Mm-hmm. She, from a young age, from before she married or even knew Ralph Waldo Emerson, she was engaged in all kinds of activities. Opposed to slavery, for example, opposed to the mistreatment of animals and things like that. Once she marries Emerson, she seems to have realized that she had a role to play. Even if it wasn't a public role, it was a private role that could ultimately influence the public. So the first thing she does is she coaxes her husband into writing a letter to the President of the United States in protest against the removal of the Cherokee people to Oklahoma.
Smithsonian Associate Dr. Randall Fuller is our guest today. We will have links in the show notes so that you can find out more information about Dr. Fuller, his work, his research, this wonderful new book, which is available in many bookstores as well as online. We'll have links so that you can find it. But again, it's titled Bright Circle: 5 Remarkable Women in the Age of Transcendentalism. So we've talked really about the four. Let's talk about the fifth woman of the story, Margaret Fuller, who, interestingly to me, a lot of this is just fascinating, all this work, Dr. Fuller, but really she's labeled, you identify her as kind of the first woman intellectual. And I thought that was amazing. She really is very responsible for kind of directing some of her views and some of her work right at women to explore philosophy, to think. At the time, that was very bold. And it's just remarkable. She's very much a part of this. Maybe tell us a little bit about her and what she did.
Yes. There's a great quote by Thomas Carlyle that he says something like, "I have never known someone who wanted to eat the world like an oyster so much as Margaret Fuller." That is, she wanted everything. She wanted a life of the mind. She wanted a life of the heart. She wanted a great romance, but she wanted to be able to do everything that she could to fulfill her potential. She too was raised by an unusual parent, in this case a father who taught her Latin and Greek and German and had her reading by the age of 4. And I point that out because Elizabeth Peabody and Margaret Fuller are unusual because of the level that they were educated to. But she quickly realizes as a young woman that there are plenty of other women who would like to be educated to that level. So one of the things that she does that I think is just incredibly important is host these conversations at Elizabeth Peabody's bookstore. Mm-hmm. And the idea is that she will lead them through readings and discussions of philosophy and literature. They will talk about the need to reform women's roles in society. It seems as though, like many book clubs, she wanted to begin with a kind of structure, but very quickly an organic conversation took over. And women involved in those conversations, without fail, describe them as life-altering and life-changing, as providing them with a perspective on their role in society that they'd never had before. So for the purposes of my book, that is her most important role. But I should mention also, she wrote the first really serious feminist argument known as Woman in the 19th Century, a full-length book in support of women's rights. She was the first woman newspaper correspondent for a major newspaper, the New York Tribune, and she was the first woman foreign correspondent who went to Italy and reported on the Italian Revolution. So she was an amazing woman who packed a lot into a short 40-year lifespan.
So great to talk to you. I could talk to you for a lot longer. I just have one kind of final wrap-up question, Dr. Fuller. So, the idea of transcendentalism, it's still with us today, very much, especially when it comes to feminism, especially when it comes to environmentalism. And I wonder, what did you learn that surprised you, and how does that apply to our readers and to our audience and to those attending the Smithsonian Associates presentation?
Yeah, two things come to mind. One is, and you've alluded to this, this appreciation of the sanctity of nature. Mm-hmm. I feel pretty certain, and Mary Moody Emerson, I feel like, was the first to articulate that, but Sophia Peabody, her sister, all of the women I described very much felt that and expressed how much they revered nature. I can't help but think all of them would have been involved in some fashion or the other working on solutions to the climate change issue. But the other thing that I think is worth mentioning is that one of the key elements of transcendentalist thought, and this was a key element that Mary Moody Emerson advanced and the others took up in different ways, is that all human beings have a divine spark within them. Previous generations understood God to be external and in charge of affairs, but not really inside the human. Mary Moody Emerson and subsequent transcendentalists make this argument that we all have a piece of divinity in us, and we all have the possibility to fulfill ourselves in this very, cosmic way, this very, very idealistic way. There is a way in which that belief really funneled into the rise of democracy in this country, and the sense that every person counts, every person is valuable, every person has a voice, and we should try to listen to those voices. And I feel as though the Bright Circle are a wonderful example of that, and one that we can use to this day.
I couldn't agree more. I just enjoyed this conversation today. The book is wonderful. Again, congratulations. Smithsonian Associate Dr. Randall Fuller has been our guest. You got to check out his upcoming presentation. We'll have links in our show notes. We'll put lots of information there about Dr. Fuller and this fantastic book of his titled Bright Circle, 5 Remarkable Women in the Age of Transcendentalism. It applies to us today, but I just enjoyed the history of these women too. And just thank you so much for sharing. Wonderful job. Selfishly, as you do more work in this area or others, please come back. We love this. Our audience will love this subject. So look forward to your upcoming. Thank you so much, Dr. Fuller. Have a great rest of your day.
You too. Goodbye.
My thanks to Smithsonian Associate Dr. Randall Fuller, who will be appearing at Smithsonian Associates coming up. Please check out our show notes today for details on his presentation titled Bright Circle, 5 Remarkable Transcendentalist Women. His book of the same name, also available at Apple Books, is Bright Circle, 5 Remarkable Women in the Age of Transcendentalism. My thanks to the Smithsonian team for all they do to support the show. Please wish them a happy 60th anniversary this year. My thanks to Sam and Miranda Henniger for all they do to help the show. And my thanks to you, our wonderful audience here on radio and podcast. Be well, be safe, and let's talk about better. The Not Old Better Show Smithsonian Associates Interview Series, 60th anniversary. Thanks, everybody. We will see you next time.
Thanks for joining us this week on the Not Old Better Show Smithsonian Associates Interview Series on radio and podcast. Join us again next time as we deep dive into some of the most fascinating real-life stories from across the world, all focused on this wonderful experience of getting better, not just older. Let's talk about better. The Not Old Better Show, Smithsonian Associates Interview Series on Community Radio.